Hello everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today I'm finally back with a video, and I plan on trying to make a series of videos today, but my thought is that the rest of the videos that I make, which will be mostly movie reviews for films like Apocalypto, Notorious, Untouchables, Fatima, and Quo Vadis, so some of those movies maybe you've heard of before, some of them maybe you've never heard of before. What I'm thinking of doing is recording reviews for those movies and putting them over at minds.com and over on Odyssey, but only having this video be the video up on YouTube, since YouTube's algorithm is always pretty wonky anyway. And also, I want to be able to do reviews for a lot of these movies, but I just, again, don't have a lot of time to do them, and also trying to put them spaced out in a certain way, again, just causes issues down the line anyway. So if you want to see some more movie reviews, make sure you follow me over on Odyssey.com and over at Minds.com. Links in the description below. But let's talk a little bit about the box office numbers, because we actually have some box office numbers here. Godzilla vs. Kong had a pretty strong weekend, especially in the midst of the COVID era that we are currently still living in, though many more theaters especially, have opened since other big films like Tenet, which ended up not being a financial success because it came out during a time when majority of theaters were still closed, especially in California and in New York. Nowadays, with Godzilla vs. King Kong, a lot more theaters are open, especially in those two states that I mentioned, and it was able to make $285.4 million, and that was, again, for the opening weekend. Total has obviously gone up a little bit. Normally what happens is that they release those initial numbers, and then they adjust those numbers slightly afterwards, and I want to say it adjusted up to around $285.8 million when everything was said and done. So obviously the movie has made more since this time period, of course, and that is something that is obviously going to come into play this weekend when we can finally look at what is its week 1 to week 2 numbers going to look like, at least domestically. It's internationally, it's going to be a little bit trickier because it has released at different countries at different times. It's doing well in certain regions, not as well in other regions, obviously because, again, of the theater space currently that we are in. Obviously doing very well in China at this point, but then again, as I always like to say, one, you can't really ever trust the numbers coming out of China anyway for any movie, but then also, two, when you look at the box office numbers themselves, even if a movie does do well in China, typically they only get about 25% of the box office gross from that movie, and a lot of people have been trying to point out, saying, well, this movie has a Chinese company working with it, and so therefore that number is not going to be the same. The issue there is that 75% that's missing is going to the Chinese government, is going to the Chinese Communist Party. And so, therefore, even if a Chinese-owned company is involved in the production of the movie, that does not mean that the movie is going to get more of its money back in China. It just means that they're going to have the same split, because you got to keep the communists happy, which again is one of the many reasons why I will be critical of pretty much any major release coming out from this point forward doing very well and promoting a lot of things in China, because of course of those issues going on there right now. But again, $285.8 million, still doing pretty well nonetheless. If you actually look at the breakdown, you see that the vast majority of that money is indeed coming from China. So again, $150 million coming from China. That is pretty gigantic, but remember, it's only going to see a very small percentage of that money down the road, which is why typically I don't like to make predictions until the first 2 weeks are done, because that's normally a pretty good metric as far as, okay, what's the week 1 to week 2 drop off domestically and sometimes internationally, since sometimes movies get released all at the same time, both domestically and internationally. But then also it gets us to get our feelers out about, how much of the drop off is it going to be, and will this movie have legs to be able to make enough money in order to make its money back in the long run. And so that's why a lot of people, I think, are kind of already jumping the gun a little bit, saying this movie is going to be a massive hit, it's going to make its money back and everything like that. And don't get me wrong, it is definitely poised to do very well at this point in time, basing it just on opening weekend numbers. These are pretty good, especially again when we think about the fact that this is coming out during the COVID era. That being said, we won't really have a good idea of how much money this film is likely to make until we actually have some week 2 numbers and get to see what kind of drop-off there is. Because if there is a massive drop-off, especially domestically, that means that the amount of money that it's going to make going forward is going to be rather limited, because they get a lot more money from American audiences and American theaters in the first 2 weeks of release than they do in any of the international marketplaces. So even though it's doing well in the international marketplace, where $237.3 million of the 285.8 total has come from, they're getting a lot less of that big chunk versus the American box office. Now, typically by the end of a movie's run, studios end up making around 60% of the entire box office gross. Again, that's typically the number what it is. Obviously, that can change depending on how well it does in different countries and other, deals and other, of course, you always have to take into account these other issues that you can never really truly account for. Like, for instance, if there's any deals with any major companies, right? How much money are they getting from those major deals per movie, per ticket being shown, right? So let's say, for instance, that in Godzilla vs. Kong, and I don't remember this from the movie, but let's say that they, feature Coca-Cola, right? Did Coca-Cola pay for, for that sponsorship, right? For that in-movie sponsorship? In a way to where they would make money based on how many views that the film actually got, or was there a predetermined amount of money? Again, these are things that we don't have all the answers to, and typically we don't get instant access to how much money they've made in those different dealings. Also, of course, we don't know how much money they're making off of HBO Max. We don't know how many people have left HBO Max, or rather have gone to HBO Max to watch the movie, how many people have accessed this through other means. Again, all of these things are still very much up in the air. So this film, again, don't get me wrong, had a very strong opening weekend, but to say that this movie is already a gigantic financial success, and some have said, oh, it's going to make over $100 million domestically, and it's going to be the first film to do so in the COVID era. Again, could it happen? Sure, but we won't really have a good idea until this weekend's numbers come in, which don't come in typically until Sunday, and then we don't get the final numbers really until Monday morning at some time. And again, this is something that they are slowly starting to get back into the routine of, because for so long now they have not had any numbers to report, and so a lot of these sites have been putting their sites elsewhere, focusing on different metrics and things like that. And so again, we have to wait for all these numbers to come out, because let's just break down the actual numbers themselves. So you can find this information over on my website, ombreviews.home.blog. I know, working on the getting a domain for that at some point in the future. But anyway, this is under the tab listed as box office tracking. And as you can see, for Godzilla vs. Kong, right, for its opening weekend, it was $285.4 million. And so again, these are the numbers being reported from the numbers from Box Office Mojo. Typically, I go from the numbers, though, because Box Office Mojo, I try to use as little as possible. Now, we don't have the 2-week total yet. Once we do, that's when I'll be able to make my projections as far as what's the max this film is likely to make and what's the minimum amount this film is likely to make. And again, obviously, these numbers are absolutely estimates, but I'll use Wonder Woman 84 as an example of how we were able to get to these various metrics. So let's go into some more numbers for Godzilla vs. Kong. The total budget for the film was $200 million. Now, again, this is an estimate. There are some people saying it was as low as $150 million, or some saying it was $175, $185, right? The range is being given all over the place, but basically, I chose the $200 million budget because it came to me from one of the more honest sources, or one of the sources, and again, typically when you look for this information, you'll find, again, different websites will post different information, and so the website that posted this information, so typically I get it from either Deadline or Hollywood Reporter, I typically take their numbers as being the best possible metric, because I feel like they take into account a lot of other things where, other sites might try and lowball, and other sites might try and highball it. I feel like that they're the ones that are a little bit more trustworthy. But again, this is obviously an estimate as well, which is why it's listed as such. But let's assume that it was a $200 million budget. Well, when you take into account marketing, you always got to multiply that by 1.5, because that's typically what a studio will spend on marketing. Now, the other major quagmire and the other major, I guess, question in all of this is, well, how can we really know how well off a studio is? Because nowadays, so many different studios actually produce the movie, right? Actually put money and put skin into the game. If you look into this movie, Godzilla vs. Kong, Legendary had a vast majority of the money put into this movie, where Warner Brothers didn't have nearly as much in it. And so therefore the question is, if the film loses money, is it that just Legendary lost money because of the fact that they put in like 75% of the budget, or would it be a loss all around? And again, these are also where you get complicated. That's why for me, when I do box office tracking, I just look at the basic numbers. Okay, here's the projected budget. Here's what the projected cost with marketing would be just in general for the entire movie. And then I can say whether the entire movie all around was successful or not, based on these metrics, and not necessarily breaking it down from studio to studio. But again, some people like to, know that kind of information, and so want to dive deeper into it, which if you want to do that, go right ahead and do so. I just think that you'll be chasing a very long path that will not get you any clear answers, or any clearer answers than what I have in front of us. And so let's go ahead and go to the current box office. Current box office, as I said, $285.8 million. That's the last time I checked on the 5th. But again, as you saw, it's the 9th, and that is still the number because, again, those numbers are not updating daily. That's something that, again, typically happens in a normal cycle. But again, we're not really in a normal cycle at this point. And so therefore, what we're currently looking at is around $128.5 million loss. Now, this is after 1 week, and so therefore, if this weekend is very successful for them, if they're able to get, and I think I mentioned this in a previous video in a review that I did or during a live stream, if they're able to get to the $350 million mark worldwide this weekend, at that point, I will be very much like, yeah, this film's going to make money. Because at that point, when you do the math on that, they'll only have to make so much money in order to break even. Now, some people look at these numbers and say, wait a minute, that math doesn't make a lot of sense. I see $300 million cost, $285 million box office. Shouldn't that mean that it's only about $15 or $20 million that they need to make up? Well, remember, by the end of their run, they only get about 60% of the box office. And so this final number of the current gain or loss is dependent upon how much money they put into the movie and how much money they're actually going to receive from that final number. And so I'm assuming the 60% off at this point, or rather the 60% of that total at this point. So it's actually probably lower than that, which means that the loss is actually higher because, as I said before, if you take into account places like China, for instance, where they take a lot less money, and that's where the majority of their money has come from, it really makes it a little bit more difficult to be able to, again, determine how much money it's made, at least at this point in time. And again, all these are also based on estimates. So let me go again back to what we saw as far as the potentiality for in Wonder Woman 1984. So as you saw for 1984, the budget was $200 million, $300 million, so very similar. It's actually very, very similar to what we see and what we saw with Godzilla vs. Kong. The difference, of course, being Kong made $285.4 million in its opening weekend, whereas Wonder Woman 84 made only $85 million, and then by 2 weeks in, had only made $118.5 million, nowhere even close to the opening weekend that Godzilla had after all the markets had reported. And so, with that being said, as you can see, though, based on the numbers that we got, though, for that movie, the projections that I made was that it would make between $169 and $237 million by the end of its run, and it ended up around $165. And so as you can see, these estimates can still be off, and so it's actually underneath. It's actually, it actually did a lot worse than my minimum projection there, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's COVID, that they released on HBO Max first, but then again, Godzilla vs. Kong also, or rather at the same time that they released 1984, at the same time as their theatrical release, but Godzilla vs. Kong did the same thing and yet did not see their numbers suffer as much. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Wonder Woman 1984 was really not that great, and Godzilla vs. Kong is getting a lot more positive reception from a lot of people. Now, I'm very critical of it. I don't think it's that great of a film. The story sucks, and there's some people that say, I don't care about the story, I just care about my kaiju monster fighting. Okay, good for you. Doesn't make it a good movie. A good movie, you need to have a good story, and if the story is not good, but you have your fun kaiju action, you can subjectively enjoy it. It's still an objectively bad movie because the story is completely trash. But with all that being said, since the movie has already made a lot more than what Wonder Woman 1984 made by the end of its run. Again, $165.7 million is the last I checked as far as what Wonder Woman 1984 made by the end of its run. It's already vastly improved over that. Wonder Woman was around a $200 million loss for Warner Brothers, so obviously a pretty bad showing there. We're not going to see that same loss here for Godzilla. In fact, we'll probably end up seeing a positive net return. But again, a lot of that's going to depend on what numbers we see this weekend, and we don't have those numbers yet. So what does this all mean? It means Godzilla vs. Kong is doing very well for its opening weekend, but there are a lot of factors that could impact its second weekend, and we'll have to wait and see what those numbers are to be able to make any predictions. And obviously, I could come back on Sunday or Monday whenever we get those numbers and then say, boom, the movie's going to make money, or, oh, it's already made its money back, or something like that, if it's doing incredibly well. But we don't know that yet. So for all the people out there saying, it's a success whether you like it or not, it's like, no, my opinion on the movie has nothing to do with the actual numbers themselves. I'm just presenting the information that we actually have in front of us. And again, if you don't like the information in front of us, well, hey, I can't help you with that because that's just what the numbers are at this point. But anyway, what are your thoughts about all of this stuff? Do you think that Godzilla vs. Kong is going to be a financial success? And if you do, what are you basing it on? Let me know in the comment section below. If you like this video, smash that like button, especially smash the fire button if you're watching over on Odyssey. As I said, I also upload these to Minds.com, and if you want to find more videos exclusive to Odyssey and Minds.com, including movie reviews for films, as I mentioned earlier in the video, and other movies, go check out Odyssey and Minds.com. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and as always, God bless. And now for a huge shout out to all of my April Patreon and Subscribe Star members: Andrew Hoyle, Animation Commentator, Biffer the Hobbit, Brian P., Divex, Enrique Evangelista, Dion, Father Christopher Miller, Hail to you, Father, Father Damian Cook, Garrett Searles, Humor and Hobbies, Inflamed Wood, It's a Trap Productions, Jason Clark, Jacob Juice, Jeffrey Toone, Jonathan Carney, Lance, Laura Story, the Modern Major General, Mike Jackson, Mad Mitch Dunaway, Mr. Peabody and his evil twin with the beautiful hair, On to June, Orange Hat Reviews, Out of Step with Reality, Priscilla Hall, Riff Magos, Rosetta Allen, Steve Glasker, Teresa Martin, Theodore Bendon, Tina Bojan, and of course, the Empress of the Universe, Tina B. And my Subscribe Star Subscribe Star members, Fast Reaction, Nosferatu Gatsu, Stan 4, John B., Perpetual Punster, Mr. Roy, Glinzer, J. Alex McCarthy Jr., Dean Heiss / the new number 2, J-Rod the Beer Guru, Nevanon G. Adams, and ZK Man. Thank you to all of my Patreon and Subscribe Star members. If you want your name shouted out at the end of every single video and live stream, check out the links in the description to find out how to sign up on Patreon and Subscribe Star. Also, you'll find out how to get access to things like giveaways of Blu-rays and 4K titles and digital codes, and also access to an exclusive podcast for my Keepers of the Bifrost, and also the Chosen of Valhalla level, where you can not only get all of those things, you also get a t-shirt and get to be featured on a live stream once a month hosted on the OMB Reviews channel. Anyway, if you want to have access to any of those things, check out the links in the description for Patreon and Subscribe Star for more information. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and as always, God bless.